So I'll start saying welcome, and then I'll greet everyone. I see Katia here and Susanna. Lovely to see you guys. And yes, friends from all over. Isn't this great? And Deborah will let me know when everybody has been admitted. Hi.
Everybody waiting is in.
Right, I see Paolo and
Hi, Paolo.
and also Elaine. Thank you for being with us. And then many people whose face at the moment I cannot see, but I see friends. And I'm delighted that we get together virtually in Dublin. Of course, on these occasions, we find out that the only person in Dublin is perhaps just myself, but it is an event of the Italian Cultural Institute of Dublin, and we are delighted to have Andrea Moro as protagonist for tonight's event, which is dedicated, it's a series, as you know, dedicated to maps, borders, and territories. And it is a collaboration with the Italian Institutes of London and Edinburgh. I see the director of the Italian Cultural Institute in London with us tonight. Thank you, Katia, for being with us. And yes, so Andrea Moro was at the Institute a few years ago. Actually, I think the first time he came was in 2018 to speak about the book on the impossible languages. And the following year, he was here to talk about Il segreto di Pietramala, his first of many upcoming novels. But this year, the book we will have as perhaps protagonist of this evening is this one. I don't know if Andrea will be talking about this book in particular, but he will certainly speak about the boundaries of languages. Andrea Moro is professor of general linguistics at the University of Pavia, at the Scuola Universitaria Superiore di Pavia. He's written scholarly essays, but also, as I said, a novel, and the novel is Il segreto di Pietramala. And perhaps we will start from Pietramala. It's bad stone, bad rock. So welcome to Dublin, Andrea, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you, and thank you, Renata. Thank you, everybody in here. I see Paolo Acquaviva, a longtime friend of mine. Thank you for inviting me. Actually, when you told me that I was going to talk about boundaries, I thought that I always had this kind of misleading idea of boundary, because for me, boundaries are the limit of variation of languages. Actually, many years ago, in order to try to explain myself and tell people what I was doing, I was telling that I was trying to search for the boundaries of Babel, which is the limit of variation of languages. And it's this idea of boundaries of Babel that took me directly to Pietramala. For the book, Il segreto di Pietramala, The Secret of Pietramala, is first of all a collection of sentences of other people's, and they're hidden. Most of them are just hidden. And one is in the title. And let me just start from this very first point as a prequel. Pietramala struck me when I first read about it, because what you see here is the first page of the De Vulgare Eloquentia by Dante Alighieri. And I want to show that I know Latin. And so this is the very point where Dante talks about Pietramala. Why? What does he say about this city? The city itself is a very small village close to Florence that was practically a personal property of a family that was against the Alighieri. So you can set it in a typical kind of contrast of Italian families. But the very point where he speaks about Pietramala says the following thing. Pietramala is a great city indeed, very ironical, the home of the greater part of the children of Adam. For whoever is guided by such an obscene reasoning as to think that the place of his birth is the most delightful spot under the sun, may also believe that his own language, his mother tongue that is preeminent among all others, and as a result, he may believe that his language was also Adam's. As you see here, you immediately have three ingredients that you put together in the series that you organized in Dublin. You have a regional boundary. In fact, you have a city. Then you have the idea of better languages. Languages, according to, and this is what he criticizes actually, could be ranked. There could be a language which is better than the other. And third, the idea that the first language was the best one, because even at that time, the original idea was that languages progressively decay. You have to go very, many centuries after to get Rousseau's own thinking about the decay of languages from an original perfect framework. So as you see here, the ingredients are immediately there. You have this little city where people think they speak their language. Actually, as I said, the Dante was interested, and this quotation should be clear enough. It behooves us to hunt for the language believed to have been used by the men who never had a mother, nor drank her milk, the men who never saw either childhood or maturity. So the idea in the medieval times, but I warn you, it was preserved throughout the centuries up to the 20th centuries, was that we have to find the first language, the best language. Just to close the Pietramala thing, I want to show how Dante, in fact, although we cannot say that the Vulgare Eloquenza represent a modern view of language. I think that all linguists would agree. If I could discuss about it with Paolo, we could take all night long to say what are the points in the book where he reveals the fact that he was actually going, he was not really modern in many view. For example, he thought that Latin was created after the vulgar, the languages that were around and be spoken in Europe. But there is a very interesting thing that he said concerning the ranking among languages. Look what he said. This is the last quotation, so I don't want to be too boring, but it's worth reading it. The yellow part is the salient one. But to me, however, the whole world is a homeland, is Dante speaking. Like the sea to fish, though I drank from the Arno before cutting my teeth and loved Florence so much that because I loved her, I suffer exile injustly. He never give up the political thing. So I suffer exile unjustly. And I will weigh the balance of my judgment more with reason than with sentiment. And although for my own enjoyment, or rather for the satisfaction of my own desire, there is no more agreeable place on earth than Florence, yet when I turn the pages of the volume of poets and other writers by whom the world is described as a whole and its constituent parts, and when I reflect inwardly on the various locations of places in the world and their relations to the two poles and the circle of the equator, I'm convinced and firmly maintain that there are many regions and cities more noble and more delightful than Tuscany and Florence. It's a lot for someone from Florence to say this, where I was born and of which I am a citizen, and many nations and people who speak a more elegant and practical language than do the Italians. This was the closing of this, of course, of the we're staying in the first book or the fourth. We only have two because he stopped writing the entire treatise. But it's interesting because to Dante was already clear that passion and personal commitment was the thing that was used to say that one language was better than the other, and the connection of the language to literature And if you look at things like that, I mean, there cannot be a better language better than the other. Now, why am I insisting on this idea that there is a modern tendency to not to realize that ranking among languages is dangerous? Let me make it just a premise. My conviction is that the most difficult enemies to face are those who do not declare themselves as such. They sneak in among us without being recognized and disguise themselves so as to be accepted or even applauded by many. And I think that this happens with the idea and happens with linguistics. I want to show you one interesting, let me show this explosive mixture. I call it explosive mixture because of the following thing. This is the core part of the book, and one that I hope helps us to understand the hidden roots of racism. There are two ideas that do not imply each other, first, and each of one in isolation is not dangerous at all, but the combination of the two generates an explosive mixture. What the ideas are, the first one is the following: some languages are better than others. For those who think that this is an old-fashioned idea, consider that, for example, there was a book in Italian that was one of the bestseller called La Lingua Geniale, the smart language. That was the idea by Andrea Moro. That was a very interesting book, but the idea, it was the description of ancient Greek. But the idea was that that was a smart language. There are smart languages. There are languages that are poor, illogical, incomplete, and there are languages that are better than others. And this is taken for granted by the common public. And the second thesis, which is independent, is the following one. Different languages induce different perception of reality and different reasoning. Now, you immediately understand what happens. It happens that if you combine the two, you have that, depending on the language you speak, you perceive reality and you reason in a different way. Is it dangerous? Well, let me highlight what happened let me highlight what happened in the mid of the 19th century. This book, Lectures on the Science of Language by Müller. Müller was a Bavarian linguist who published and worked in the second half of his life in Great Britain, was very straightforward. I just highlighted a few points of the book that should warn us. First, he was saying that he was linking that the idea of the presence of certain letters. Do you see this arrow here? Moving over, no, you don't. But anyway, what he was saying, as you see here, that the presence of certain letters in certain languages or family of languages is the inability of some races. He was immediately connecting the idea of presence of sound to the notion of race. Second thing, there are differences among sounds that are also incomprehensible to certain races again. Third, this is considered to be the best race of all. And why is it so? Because it's, in fact, Aryan means noble, because that was a society that had perfect relationships, perfect ideals, perfect words, perfect languages, and after all, could be compared to another race that was different and didn't have that capacity to develop the same kind of language, which is the Jewish race. Eventually, for those who consider linguistics as a peripheral aspect of this research, notice that the conclusion was that the question whether the races living were Aryan or Turanian, another group, an ethnic group, can be settled by languages only. This was the ignition of the idea of the supremacy of the Aryan race. Actually, interestingly enough, Müller realized he was wrong. There are very interesting works by Anna Morpurgo Davies, who very interestingly, this showed that Max Müller, by the end of his career, was clearly aware of the fact that this was not a reasonable conclusion, that it was completely misleading. So among the linguists, this idea of the supremacy of language, the Aryan language and the Aryan race was gone. But the propaganda of the Western culture, in fact, did another thing. And from linguistics, they proceed toward the idea of eugenetics. As you see here, you have the racial law in Nuremberg in 1936. But needless, it's the following image I want to show you is very interesting because it shows you that it was not just a failure or let's say an effect of the Nazi propaganda. In fact, the Nazi produced this other advertisement, "Wir stehen nicht allein," we do not stand alone, where you see here in black and white a number of flags that show you the states that were implementing racial laws. In fact, Louisiana 1924 had one of the first racial law to prohibit marriage between people, black and white people. And of course, Italian came and adopted the law to difesa della razza, to defend the race. So as you see here, I cut a very, very, very long story short, but what we need to be aware of is that first, the entire enterprise that came from the Nazi propaganda of eugenetics came from a consideration that started from linguistics and from the way we consider languages to be filtered to understand the world, and what I think it's really dangerous, the fact that both theses are still autonomously considered to be reasonable by large, part of the cultural communities in our contemporary society. What I do in the book that you were mentioning before, La Razza e la Lingua, I try to show that we have all the tools to dismantle both of the theses. In fact, as you see here, perception of reality and different reasoning. It comes without saying it that we cannot really measure perception of reality. We don't even know what reality is. Understanding on how we can measure it is a complex thing. But for those little sectors of reality where we can measure perception, for example, perceiving the colors, then we can make serious experiments. So one of the interesting things that I report in the book is that all those researchers that try to compare the languages that have different number for colors turn up to have people that have the same perception of the colors. And when it comes to reasoning, again, reasoning is too broad a term to be measurable, but we have logic. And when it comes to logic, we can actually dismantle and we can decompose the logical components of grammar and show that there are universal aspects of grammar that must be there before any experience. So they must be there because we are all, in a sense, prepared by the same kind of biological program. In other terms, there are no better languages. This is the end of the conclusion that I try to draw. Perception of reality and logic does not depend on grammar of a language because all languages are essentially a variation of the same biological project characterizing all and only human languages. We are one unique race. If you want to take a look at this kind of a systematic view of language in a biological perspective, there's this paper that I had the undeserved opportunity to write with Angela Fiederici, Noam Chomsky, Robert Burke, John Bellewitz, which is a kind of summary. And of course, since you mentioned the novel, I wanted to reach the major, as many people as I could. So first of all, I tried to coin this word eulinguistics, as a mimic of the eugenetics. But I wanted to see in the history who to try to find and impose smart languages, at least in the history of Western culture. That was extremely interesting. One, striking example is Orwell grammar, the English. This is Ingsoc, I don't know how you pronounce it in how it has to be pronounced in English, but it was actually the um, the image that we use for this kind of artificial language that would have had to substitute English. But there are very many other cases in the history. And so the funny thing about this is that when I try to take this theory and build a story on the theory to reach more people than those who normally read scientific papers, I wrote this novel. And I put inside the novel, as I said before, a lot of hidden quotation. Three of them were the experiments that were done and described in the Western culture to find out what language children were speaking. One, for example, one tremendous experiment was done by those who described children raised by a woman whose tongue was cut because they didn't want the children to hear any language. And interestingly enough, they describe the fact that the children died because there was no interaction. But this was not, the fruit of my fantasy. It was just taken from the literature. And if I tell you the number of readers that wrote me back to say how cruel I was to have invented this, tremendous torture, it's amazing. But this is it, and this is this is a way to write 3 books with one idea. It's the same thing all over and over, and interestingly enough, people buy it. I shouldn't say that though, but it's just one of the hidden revolution of the 20th century. People, even if they don't understand it, know that time is relative, know that the quantum physics rules the understanding of the world. I really want people to understand that the revolution ignited by Noam Chomsky, that is, that the structure of our language has biological boundaries, is to be known by a lot of people, because that will tell us that we are one race. As to what happens within the boundaries is for the historian of linguistics, for those who are interested in literature and mutation of languages. But our role is that of fixing those boundaries. And that's my my small contribute to the field.
Well, I think it is fascinating, Andrea, and thank you very much for kind of summarizing all the process that's behind all your research and your outreach to the public. One thing that is itself a novel is this revolution that Chomsky undertook, and it is the central point of your book, which is really difficult to grasp at first. So maybe you want to tell us more. And then there is a very interesting point whereby you talk about this a person that got the Nobel Prize for Medicine, who speaks about a generative grammar for the
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, that's it. I'm glad you picked that up, because actually the thing that Renata observed, this is something that I used to tell people ever since I first knew about it. But and then you realize why I'm saying that. In this pandemic era, well, it's 1 year. It will be over soon, crossing fingers. But still, it's interesting. Now, let me recap it, try to re-summarize the idea. Chomsky says the following thing. Grammars are too complex to be the product of direct teaching. It cannot be the case that parents or the community take every children and tell her or him exactly how to compose words and so on and so forth. They can do sometimes. So for example, the Italians, children, probably Renata and Paolo did the same thing as I did. If you hear vendere, venduto, which is to sell, sold, they have piangere, piangiuto, cry, cried, or weep, wept. But in fact, there is no piangiuto, there is pianto, and nobody knows exactly why. But they can intervene in that. And so Chomsky says the following thing. If children are born with an innate boundary, it must be the case that they are available to learn languages they may never, they're programmed to learn languages they may never encounter. So, you know, we may, the community here, the people who are here now, you know, we may all speak a couple of languages. Maybe there are people who speak many more, and then they speak their dialect. I speak the dialect from a Northern Italian dialect as well. But, and I tried to study, you know, I study Greek and Latin and so on. I can read some French, but there are languages that I would never access. Maybe languages ideally that have not even been born. And then the question, the deep question that people ask is, why is nature silly? Why is there that abundance in our mind? What I call the STEM mind. The STEM mind is one that can go, when it comes to language, into one direction or another, exactly as the stem cells can become cell of the skin or the hair or of the liver. Why is nature so unwise as to give us this abundance? Is it conceivable that we have a biological theory of language and we have this irrational abundance? And then something very interesting happened. During the 80s, there was this question: how do we construe antibodies when an antigen, an antigen, I never know how to say that, gets, you know, when a virus, let's say, when a virus gets in contact with our body? Is it prepared at the moment? If so, the doctor said we would expected a much slower reaction of the organisms. So someone said, well, but then it could be the case that for a certain portion of our immune system, we are endowed before any experience of an abundant number of antibodies, exactly paralleling what happens to language and to I want to see if I have this diagram I want to show, and and the same thing that happens with the immune system happens with language. So in other terms, what you see here, this is, I promise you, it's an old picture that I used before this thing. When I talk to you, your mind must decipher the grammar of the sentences, but if I sneeze against you, your body has to decipher something else, and which is the microbe. So as with languages, the idea is that we're endowed with abundant repertoire of antibodies, which may contrast diseases we'll never be exposed to. You could consider this a very silly thing, but the person who had this thought is one of the founders of modern immunology, and he got the Nobel Award in 1983. And the first and practically the only person he cites in his Nobel Award is Noam Chomsky. And this is one of the sentences, and Niels Jerne is the name. I find it astonishing that the immune system embodies a degree of complexity that suggests some more or less superficial, though striking analogies with human language. So as you see, there is nothing contradictory in a biological view of language that says that people are endowed with the capacity to learn more languages they meet, because nature used to do that things the same way in other domains of biology, such as, for example, immunology. The idea of learning by forgetting, this is a term originally proposed by Jean-Pierre Changeux and Jacques Meller, who thought that learning is in fact pruning those structures you don't use. And this more or less also happens with that part of the immune system. So the fascinating, actually, you know what, in order to explain this, the protagonist of the novel, of the Segreto di Pietramala, is Elijah. He's a guy that has 6 fingers on his left hand, because I wanted people to understand that, you know, your body is crucial to the way you think about reality. So having 11 fingers make you think that when you buy eggs, at least in my own country, you have one egg free for free after the other. But the interesting thing is that the mother and the father of this guy, one is a cook and the other is a gardener, which are the two opposite way of mixing pieces of reality to construct something. If you're a cook, you put things together. If you're a gardener, you prune. And the result is in both cases something interesting and perhaps beautiful, but it comes from two different processes. When it comes to learning, we are more similar to gardeners than cooks because we have a lot in and we just have to prune the part we don't use.
This is fascinating. And you know, Andrea, there is already one question. I don't know if you can see the chat. And Nicola Donzelli has a question for you, and he has written it, or maybe he wants to actually
Chat, let me say. Okay, so I yeah, oh yes, I can access it. Which one you want me to read? The last one is by Nicola Donzelli. Shall I read it?
Or yes,
Yeah.
I think everybody can see it actually, but
okay, no, since I have worked, hello, ciao, Nicola. And Nicola says, since I have worked in multicultural environments with prevalence of Anglo-Saxon culture above all others, and have witnessed and experienced cultural and linguistic racism very many times, I was wondering if anything is being done to address this issue in the society. Very good question. I tried, but I share the same experience with you. I want to tell you, I won't reveal the person because he's not here. But I gave a conference in Paris and I received a message by a colleague, a distinguished European linguist, not French. That's the only thing I can tell you, who warned me for telling these things. He didn't even attend to the conference, but he warned me. And I have the email, so just in case someone is going to sue me for this, I will take the email. He warned me because he said, you're not really, you don't want to really say that all languages are equal when it comes to concept. So for example, in my language, he is a German-speaking person, it's clearly the case that I can access many more complicated concepts because my language has, you know, kind of, you know, compound words that are bigger than others, I would just say. Well, I didn't even answer to him, but in reality, this issue has not been enough addressed. And if I may say something, you know, I take advantage of this invitation and the fact that you are here. If you're here listening to me and you haven't left yet, it must be the case that you're really interested because I'm not good enough. But there is one thing I want to say, at least in Italian, people are ashamed to use the word razza, race, which is actually the etymological origin of race as well. They don't want to say razza. And they tend simply, they don't say razza, but I use a different word in exactly the same sense. They use etnia from ethnos. In fact, if you look on the major Italian encyclopedia, the so-called Treccani, you see that the meaning of ethnia is exactly overlapping the one of razza. Now, there is one thing I want to say. Biologists came to the conclusion that there is no such a thing as a race. On the other hand, and this is my point, it's clearly the case that we need some words to express the facts that there are some phenotypical traits that are characteristic and inherited by the parents. if my parents were black people, I would be black. My parents have the eyes, the Asian eyes, I would have them. Now, the problem is that dismantling the idea of race, but leaving but cannot coincide with the idea that people don't recognize this generalization. What is really to be condemned is not the fact that people are black, white, or have different shapes, but they can understand reality in exactly the same way. This is the real issue. There is no such a thing as a language and a culture that allows you to better understand the world. And this has not been addressed at all. People concentrate on the physical facts. I tried to highlight that thing in the book. I also raised the issue of prego, Nicola. I also raised grazie mille. I also raised the very important issue of gender language. I consider it legitimate, but it has to be considered as a political issue. It's not a linguistic issue. As you all know, especially in languages like Italian, which are morphologically very rich, in many cases, you have the so-called neutralization phenomena. So if I say the students in English, you obviously don't know if they're male or females, but when you say that in Italian, you have to characterize them in masculine or feminine. Now, is it legitimate to say that we should express studentesse and studenti? So I think we should, to the extent that we realize that it's not by changing the language that we change society. It's not this linguistic maquillage that does anything to language. If that were so, it could be the case that languages that have no gender, like Turkish, are the perfect society. And if you look at the ranking of the way that women are treated in Turkish society, they have their salaries, which is something that is not objectable, is less than a half of the one of males. So I used to say, I think I also said that in the book, I'm old enough to remember that people used to, oh, thank you. I also remember that when I was a boy, women started to dress trousers. There was nothing, that was not an anatomical choice. In fact, it could have been the other way around. Males should have given up trousers, should have used skirts, if anything. It was a political choice. There was nothing biological in that. Anything goes when it comes to equality among people. Anything goes. And this is why one of the reasons why I realized that only afterwards. In the back of the book, I said that, that Babel, the tower, is considered to be a damnation. And I said something like that it's a gift, and perhaps all differences are gifts. There was something even, so to speak, biologically true in the advantage that we humans speak different languages. We don't know why. We don't know why we don't have just one language. And I don't have an explanation for that. But I have a clue as to the positive effect of Babel. Suppose we start humanity from scratch and we have only one language. Do you know what is going to happen? Everyone is going to congregate in the same place. So if all humans congregated in the same place when there was no technology, how could you feed them? How could you give them water? How could you, organize cemeteries and so on and so forth? The very fact that humans were endowed with this extraordinary gift of not understanding each other has given us the opportunity to have this social distanciation that we now search for in a way that came for free. Probably humanity would not have lasted if we only had one language, because people would have, it's like going to the beach in summer. They would have gone on the same beach altogether, and we would have lost the fun.
I think it is so great to, you turn things around so that you see, as you said it in the embroidery, similar years in the book, you see what's behind the surface, we see it, and then we see the connections if we look from behind. One person, Chiara, asks whether a translation of La razza e la lingua is coming out.
It is, but in Chinese. And but they're trying that the book is kind of new. Actually, I really must say that I have a lot of threatening messages, but if one thing I would very much like for it to be translated, even anonymously, because this is something that really touches people's heart. There is something which is kind of the opposite of what I said, or not the opposite, but is at a different level. Everyone speaks with an accent, even people of the same nation, and we are very humans have a very fine control of accents. For example, I live in a very small town, very very close to Milan. Paolo knows that town. It's Pavia. It was the capital of the Longobards reign, though, and actually, Pavia is very close to where Columban funded his library, close to here. So the connection with the Irish culture is extraordinarily interesting. So Pavia is 70,000 inhabitants, has a river, and if you go from one and the other side of the river, pronouns are pronounced in a different way. Sometimes you can pick up different accents even in the same even in the same building, depending on whether you live on the top floor or in the dungeon, so to speak. Why are we so clearly designed to pick up accents? Well, one thing is actually it's due to the fact that uh, uh, the sense of we feel we belong to the people who speak like us. And this is, in the one hand, a very nice, a very nice fact. For example, singing, which is one of the most interesting activity of humans, is a way of using a lot of it's like a symphony of accents in a sense. There is nothing. It's like speaking with one voice. But on the other, the very fact that you can have different accents is also another way of distancing people. And so there is a mixture in between these two facts. If you live in the northern part of Italy, if you lived in the northern part of Italy, say in the 70s, and you were an immigrant from the south, it was enough for you to not to pronounce the vowel in the proper way, that you were considered to be a stranger. And as you know, barbaric comes from the Greek barbaros, which means a stuttering person, the one that is not able to express himself. So we have a lot of connotation that really tells us that languages are not only those abstract, beautiful mathematical stuff that I like to study, but they are also part of our passion. In fact, I think that Dante was clear when he said, although for my own enjoyment, or rather for the satisfaction of my own desire, there is no more agreeable place on earth. You see, probably the book was written in Latin, but he would probably use the same words he used in the Paradise, because it's a pleasure. The words he used to describe a good language are the words that belong to the semantic domain of physical pleasure, which is interesting. But you have to be careful, especially Italian. The Italian are fond of telling themselves that we have a very lingua musicale. Don't tell a German child that calls Mutter his mother that is not musical. Of course it is. Of course it is.
No, it's also funny to think that the greatest, pleasure derived from Latin is expressed in Italian, and the greatest prize to Italian is expressed in Latin. So I think Dante really plays on both fields. And we have a very complex and interesting question from Hillary. I don't know if you can see it.
Yes, I can. Can I read it so that to share? Okay, so mille grazie and per questo bello discorso. In the 17th century, a number of scholars, including Italian Jesuits such as Kircher, searches for a universal source for language and one that reinforced a particular theological view. Are our inquiries and investigation of language as per Eco and others also a search for a scientific coherence in Leo theology? I'm interested in what we are searching for when looking at the origins and commonality between languages and the social and political ideas contained. This is an incredibly interesting question. Actually, there is another little book. It's a very little book that I wrote, and it has been translated into Italian, which is a collection of 17 sentences by linguists. The title is "I think, therefore I am." Therefore I speak. No, I speak, therefore I am. And it has been translated by, in fact, as a gift by a friend of mine teaching in Cambridge, England, Ian Roberts. I mean, the fact that you have a friend that for free gives you a translated book. The reason why I'm saying that is one of the 17 sentences is a sentence by Roger Bacon, who he was a modist. In the medieval time, there was this idea that there was one world, one mode of existing, one mode of signify things, and one mode of let's say of combining the three things. So the idea was that the sentence was, grammar is one and the same in all languages because of its substance, although it may accidentally have variation. In Latin, sounds like grammatica una et eadem est in omnibus linguist secundum substantiam licet accidentaliter varietur. And that idea is exactly as you said in the final part of your question, a purely theological unified view of grammars. The modern theory is purely biological. I don't know what people will tell about us in 200 years or 500 years. Everyone has a partial perspective of things. We are saying that there are biological boundaries. We believe that there is enough empirical support to sustain this theory. But the coherence of other view for the universal source for language, as you said there, Hillary, is a very interesting source of understanding. And well, there is one thing that I want to say. Nowadays, our faith into machines has become, again, extraordinarily irrational. We are going back to the danger of the 50s when Hilary Bar Hillel, a logician that worked at MIT, realized that people felt to be very close to what he called the full understanding of communication in animals and machine. I don't know if I have his citation here. No, I don't. But interestingly enough, yes, I do. I do have it here. This is Bar Hillel citation. There was an ubiquitous and overwhelming feeling around the laboratory at MIT that with the new insight of cybernetics and the newly developed techniques of information theory, the final breakthrough towards a full understanding of the complexity of communication, the animal and the machine, has been achieved. Look, what you have here is machine and animal. Humans disappeared. There's no space for humans if you have the idea that statistics is enough to understand the language. Chomsky dismantled this fact by putting together three ingredients: complexity, among of any language, uniformity among languages, and spontaneous language acquisition by children. And look at his citation. The fact that all normal children acquire essentially comparable grammars of great complexity with remarkable rapidity suggests that human beings are somehow specially designed to do this with data handling or hypothesis formulating ability of unknown character and complexity. What the reason why I'm telling you this is that there is a new theology around, which is called artificial intelligence, and our faith into statistical and algorithmic understanding is leading us to another kind of irrational idea for the source of unique languages. We have to be warned about this. Will machines speak? When people ask me this thing, I used to, steal and declare that a sentence by Alan Turing. People ask him, "Will computer think?" And there is a famous quotation that I put in the book where he said, "Well, by the end of the century, the word thinking will be so changed that it will be reasonable to say that machine thinks." He never said machine will think. It's the word thinking that will be changed. So will machines speak? Probably, if we extend enough the semantic of speaking, we will end up saying that I speak with my phone and then my phone speaks. But it's purely a business issue. People want to sell stuff. And so if you buy certain telephones, they tell you that the processor inside is a neural engine. We don't know anything more. We know very little about neurons. But when you have to sell something, it's a neural engine. People will laugh at it. Maybe not, maybe even sooner than a century. We don't hear you, Renata. We have to.
Mille grazie, professore.
Oh, grazie a lei.
Moro ha risposto benissimo alla mia domanda, una domanda abbastanza complicata. Mi dispiace.
No. I really, one of the reasons why.
Chat.
Why Renata is fantastic. It's because she always exposes me, to people who are really interested and make the toughest questions. So.
Not at all. Mille grazie. And I'll definitely find I Speak Therefore I Am.
Oh,
That's very interesting.
Hope you like it. Grazie a lei.
Okay.
Right. So Andrea, now you have a question from a friend. And the question is in Italian. I think most of us understand it, but I don't know. And Paolo, with whom normally we would go to have a glass of wine after these events. So it is really something we missed tonight. We'll try to pick it up for next time. Anyway, he says, "Hello, Andrea, can I offer you an idea for a discussion? The unitarity that you showed behind the variety of languages has something to do with the basis of perception and categorization. But this moves away the environmental factors and the historical factor like culture, not as opposed to nature. So people see cultural differences and therefore they think that they are rooted in the cognitive basis. People go wrong on this, but cultures and ways of looking at things are there and they're reflected in the words, not in the grammar. What do you think? Is that right? Is it wrong?"
Paolo Acquaviva, Professor Paolo Acquaviva, he's a linguist and he is a training. I think that he pointed to a very crucial issue that pertains to the capacity of the difference between thinking and verbalizing. I think that what he is suggesting, and tell me if I'm wrong, Paolo, is that we may say that all people think the same, but when it comes to the lexicon, it could be that certain languages are more apt to, expressing certain thoughts than others because they have words that express certain concepts in better way than the other. Is that correct, Paolo? No. Can Paolo?
Sorry,
Oh,
can I? Yeah,
yeah.
could I just very briefly?
Yes.
Well, I wasn't even suggesting that. Of course, you're free to. I'm simply asking for your opinion, but I wasn't thinking so much about the idea that certain languages enable us to think certain things, but simply that certain things can only be taught, not historically, okay, because certain languages, not the languages, but the people who spoke the languages,
Okay.
Elaborated a notion like mankind, nature, God, spirit, citizenship, etc., etc. People see these differences, and therefore they think, haha, you can say mankind in a certain set of languages, but not in others, because you have a certain grammar. Of course, that's wrong, but people are sensitive to culture as opposed to nature. So, what do you say to people who look for that? Why do you say? Why can you say certain things in Latin, but not in Italian, and vice versa?
First of all, I don't think that you can say certain things in Italian and not in Latin. I think you can say everything in every language. You have the advantage of, I mean, take this. I have another passion. I was in love with a verb. Anyone can be in love with what they want. I was in love with the verb to be. And interestingly enough, the notion of ontology, which comes from, you know, certain roots of the verb to be in Greek, is very, if the understanding of the notion of being depended on the presence of the verb to be and its equivalents, then in many languages, this notion would not be understandable, because many languages lack such a verb, or the function of this verb is not played by a verb, like in Hebrew, or in the present tenses in Russian. And I don't think that the Russian culture or the Hebrew culture have, you know, holes in their understanding of being. Actually, there is something very interesting. I wanted to show how linguists can be ridiculed in some sense. And the reason why the article is between brackets is clearly shown by this opinion of a German linguist. In ancient Greeks, ever since the most remote times, the linguistic premises for the elaboration of scientific thought started to develop. Natural science and philosophy couldn't be born if the definite article did not exist, because it would not be otherwise possible to establish universal concept in a determinate form or give to adjectives and verbs the value of a concept. If the definite article, sorry for the misprint, definite article didn't offer the possibility to form this abstraction. Now, this guy in 1946 is saying that languages that don't have articles cannot express generalization. Now, what about Latin? It's obviously funny. And then there was another. So what I'm saying is that I don't believe, although I always fight with this with my friend Massimo Cacciari, who takes the view that the notion of truth in Greece is supported in a way that is contrast with any other view, because aletheia means uncovered. And so he says that the notion of truth in ancient Greek is different than from other. But then I turn up to the ineffability of a potato, or potato, depending on if we prefer that. I mean, what I'm saying, sorry, the potato has gone. What I try to tell him is that in some languages, this object can be named by using one single word, such as in English potato or in Italian patata. In other, a periphrasis is required, such as in French pomme de terre, the apple of the earth, of my dialect. Nevertheless, French cooks know how to cook it. So my idea is simply the following, that part of your question is totally right. That is, culture is different. But what I want to say is it's not conveyed by languages. It cannot be accidental that the 5th century before Christ in Greece was a moment that was magical for thinking. But I don't want that to be correlated to the fact that it had certain verbs or nouns or a grammar. You see what I mean? So I agree with you that there were certain milieu of culture and language that constitute special environment. Florence in the 14th century, Athens, 4th century before Christ, many other times. I think that the time of Newton, which is my best preferred scientist, he was crazy. The idea of correlating the movement of the earth and of an apple and capture them by the same law. If you say this thing now, you're going to get into serious trouble for in psychiatric environment. But so there must be something that we don't that we cannot capture, mathematically, that makes a certain time a more lively cultural environment than the other. What I would like to insist is that cannot be the lexicon and the grammar only.
Well,
but thank you for this very stimulating.
It is, you would not believe it, but we are almost at the end of this encounter, and to keep the Dantean companionship with us, we need to be like the good dressmaker che tanto ha del panno e fa la but I don't know, and maybe there might be one more question to conclude, and allow me anyway to thank Andrea, and I hope perhaps next time you'll talk about how then are translation possible, impossible. I think that probably leads us to that big ocean of having languages working together, one near the other, how much we transmit and we bridge oceans, not only rivers.
Well, the dream is to come back and talk about the translation of the novel, which is fun.
Exactly. Yes, I think that's
but it's difficult. It's difficult.
So if there are no more questions, we'll say goodbye until next time. Next week, we'll go ahead with this series of encounters on maps, borders, and territories. And the encounter is with Ijaba Shego and her novel that deals with, yes, again, how can languages and even historical times that create a dialogue between them. Her latest novel is La Linea del Colore, and I hope to see you back here on Zoom next week. And thank you very, very much for being part of all this. And thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you, Renata.
Right.